That'll be great.
I hope you're right for all our sakes.
It's always great, even when it's not.
It's true, actually. It's the podcast that's always good, even when it maybe isn't.
Do you want to hear about the time someone dropped a wrench and nearly blew up Arkansas?
Oh, yes.
Great, because I'd love to tell you about it.
100%. You know, right, that there's a CoRri fucking banger in the chamber when you cue it up like that, and I'm like, fucking do I.
Perfect. Well, I hope this tickles
Lock
you,
and
Mark.
load.
Locked and loaded. It was September of 1980 in a missile complex deep underground in Damascus, Arkansas. As those who were there described it. You're already in, huh? Okay.
Yeah, completely.
As those who were there described it, that day, everything seemed to be going wrong, a real Murphy's Law situation. And that's not the kind of thing you like to hear about a complex that holds the most powerful nuclear missile in America's arsenal.
Oh, nuclear missiles too.
Mm-hmm.
Wicked. Yeah,
yes.
yeah. That so Titan too.
Quiet you.
Okay. Which is interesting because this week Russia have done a lot of talk about their Satan missile. So
wait, is it really called? Well, no,
yeah,
I don't want to say it.
It
really?
is. It is. Yes, it is.
Does it mean the same thing?
We'll circle back, but yes, okay, it is. I digress.
All right. So to give you some context for the missile we're dealing with here, when crew members stood at the base of it and looked up, they couldn't see the warhead at the top because it was a full 80 stories above them. It just sort of, it just disappeared into the silo from their vision range. A similar warhead was tested in the South Pacific, and the scope of its destructive power surprised even the people who designed and tested it.
Oh my God.
Which is disturbingly not uncommon, by the way. The first nuclear weapon in America was literally assembled in a tent in the desert. And having no real idea what was going to happen, they were concerned that upon detonation, it might set the Earth's atmosphere on fire, killing every single living thing on the planet.
Burn the skies.
And they did it anyway.
Yeah.
It was a real concern, and they did it anyway.
That's the great thing, isn't it, about true entrepreneurs, true pioneers.
Yep.
It might burn the fucking Earth to death.
Yeah.
Might not.
Might not. Got to try it. Only way to find out.
Good friend of mine, I believe still to this day, lives in terror of the Large Hadron Collider.
Are you talking about me?
No, I'm not. Oh, you too. There's two people I know then. Two people I know who are fucking shit scared about the Large Hadron Collider.
Yeah, understandably. I am not comfortable with all those hadrons colliding. I don't like it.
What if it was like a little bit smaller?
They were just slightly smaller hadrons, or like slightly smaller collider. Maybe
you make a good point. Is the collider itself large, or are the hadrons that it's colliding large?
I think it's the collider, but I don't know, honestly.
Back to Titan.
Not a scientist. So this missile is tested. Jesus Christ. So this missile is tested on Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific and proves to be 3 times more powerful than all the missiles deployed in World War II, including the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they realized, of course, the fallout was potentially far more deadly than the blast itself, a thing we take for granted now.
Yep.
So they transposed the map of the bomb's destruction onto a map of the US and found that if you detonated such a bomb in Washington, D.C., it would kill everyone in D.C., Baltimore, and Philadelphia, plus half the people in New York City, with casualties and fatalities as far north as Boston. That's around 450 miles or 711 kilometers. And in the UK, for reference, we're talking about a distance from Brighton on the southern coast of England to fucking Glasgow in Scotland. That's your
that's
whole
all
country.
Of the UK, then. That's the entire fucking country.
Yeah, whole thing gone.
This is Titan. This is what Titan is capable of.
Titan 2, yes. This is what it's capable of. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's great. So, of course, America was convinced we needed to amass the kind of firepower that can take out an entire island nation because we were in the grips of Cold War paranoia, deeply terrified that the Soviets were manufacturing more bombs than us. which is a weird fear in and of itself, because like
Yes.
the number doesn't feel that important. It
Yeah,
only
of course.
takes
It only takes one, of course.
yeah, it only takes one to get your point across, and a couple of
It's a
them to
really,
wipe each
really
other
good
out
point,
completely.
actually. You know,
Right?
on nuclear episode a few weeks, months, years ago, I don't know.
Whatever.
You know, demonstration of superiority by
Mhm.
a stockpile, a number
Right.
of missiles, any one of which would lead to a kind of a sequence of events which would clusterfuck the world.
And the more of them you have, the more likely bad things are going to happen by accident.
Completely.
And by this point in the 80s, America had an arsenal of some 32,000 nuclear missiles and was quite literally turning them out on assembly lines. And of course, we all know the best conditions for manufacture is in panicked haste performed by kids barely out of high school.
Yeah, making very little money, I would imagine.
Right.
That's part of the science. That's part of the science of nuclear weapons. They have to be done under just those circumstances.
Exactly.
Sweatshop,
it's very delicate.
Very, very sweatshop terror is a very particular ingredient of nuclear fission.
Doesn't work without it.
No.
So as the documentary Command and Control, based on Eric Schlosser's book of the same name, shows, our nuclear weapons were incredibly prone to accidents. They happened all the fucking time. One newscaster put it perfectly, quote, Titan II is potentially an awesome weapon of war, whose only victims so far have been Americans.
Yeah.
At this point, the Titan II missiles were also just fucking old, which made them more prone to accidents. The only reason that they were still in commission was as a bargaining chip with the Soviet Union. America figured we could say, hey, if you give up this range of nukes in your arsenal, then we'll give up these super powerful ones that we've got hanging around. That's it. We had ancient ticking time bombs sitting underground all over the United States simply because hypothetically they might be diplomatically useful in the cause for disarmament.
Yeah, you hear, very, very similar weird as fuck stories about arms currently going to Ukraine. I think I'm right in saying that the UK is currently giving Poland stocks of tanks so that Poland can then give Ukraine some of the old ass tanks that Poland have got, which they know how to use. Give them the old ones which are in use so that we can keep the kind of the chain of munitions moving.
This is how all of this nonsense works with these incredible weapons.
That stay there gathering dust for fucking decades.
Right, exactly. Like just not being used, just sitting there being potentially deadly. And these missiles here in the United States were being controlled and maintained by teenagers and dudes in their early 20s. These guys were put on 24-hour tours, during which time they were in complete control of whatever happened with the nukes. So if a command came down the line to turn the keys and send them off into the unknown, they do it without question. And again, I mean this quite literally. As one guy discussed in the documentary, they were completely unaware of who their potential targets might be. And they were more than willing to blindly destroy entire civilizations out of patriotic duty if it came to it. Quote, deterrence is worthless if you don't demonstrate that you're willing to do it too, according to this fella. I would turn those keys and kill 10 million people and never hesitate. And even in 2016, when this came out, he wasn't saying this as a critique, by the way. He was pretty proud that he'd do that.
Okay.
So on that day, this crew of youngsters found that the pressure in the oxidization tank on the missile was low. So they called in another team of baby geniuses, a specialized maintenance unit called the Propellant Transfer System Team, or PTS team, as it's more commonly known. And one of the crew from the base recalled seeing them show up and thinking like, I'm 24 and these guys look young.
Wow.
So one member of the PTS team said he remembered having his 18th birthday around this time.
Fuck that. That's obscene.
It's obscene.
Is it obscene? Is it obscene? Would I feel happier knowing that people in charge of a potentially world-ending arsenal of weapons? What's the age limit for somebody to feel happy about that? Do they need to be in their 50s? Do they need to be even older? What?
I mean, I'd say arguably these things just shouldn't exist, but I'd like someone to have at least 10 years experience before they are the people in charge, I think.
Bit of life experience under the old belt.
Right, yeah. I mean, have you met an 18-year-old recently?
Not voluntarily, mate. No.
Not voluntarily. No, nobody wants to.
unless you're listening to Jack of all Graves and you're 18, in which case
we're really happy
you and all your friends are lit, and please do come back.
Oh boy. So the PTS team also worked insanely long hours. And on that day, September 18th, they had come off a grueling couple of days and had already been on the job for 11.5 hours that day, in part because the part that they needed to actually fix the oxidization tank problem had to be flown in on a helicopter. So they had to wait around. These are, military personnel.
So what kind of training would they have gone through? What kind of
they're in the Air Force. So,
right.
That's what their background is. And then they would have been specially trained specifically to deal with the nuclear weapons. Like, they prided themselves on that. When you hear them talk about it, they were like, I loved doing this. I got to go into these silos and actually like hands-on, which the other people, the crews that were just in there all the time, they were running like control panels and stuff like that. But for the most part, they had no hands-on experience with the missiles. So on that PTS team was a guy called Dave Powell, who was sent down with a colleague to go fix the pressure problem. And that's something that shouldn't have been a ginormous deal, right? That's usually pressure is something that's pretty easy to adjust. When he got down there, though, he realized that he'd forgotten to bring a torque wrench, which was new protocol for dealing with the issue. For the few years he'd been working on the PTS team, they'd simply used a ratchet for the job. So he it slipped his mind to even grab the torque wrench on the way out of the truck. Just wasn't a thing he was thinking about. And rather than sending someone all the way up to the top to go get it, he decided to just stick with the ratchet, which was about 3 feet long and weighed some 25 pounds. For some reason, though, the ratchet...
a wrench 3 feet long weighing 25 pounds.
Yeah, it's a huge ass wrench. Yeah.
It's a big wrench.
It's a real big wrench, wielded by 2 people down there. Just like one could ultimately pull it, but it took 2 to sort of set it up.
Yep.
And for some reason, the ratchet wasn't quite fitting right. It wouldn't snap into place properly so that he could adjust the pressure valve. When his colleague, who was helping to hold it in place, asked if everything was okay, he said, yeah, and told him to let go. And it was at that moment that time slowed down for the 2 men in the silo as they watched the 8-pound socket slip from the ratchet and fall 70 feet to the floor below. And when they talk about this, it's so harrowing. They're like, I wanted to leap into the shaft after this thing. Like, I knew this could be so incredibly bad. And there was nothing you could do. It was gone. And upon hitting the ground, the socket bounced and launched itself into the side of the missile, puncturing it and sending a cloud of fuel pouring from the side. I could tell by your face. I don't have to explain to you that that's bad.
Mate, this is fucking absolutely wild. I'm gripped.
It's so wild. There are a few huge problems.
It was fuel. It was propellant that was coming out of the side. Okay.
Exactly. So a few problems here. For one, there are 2 tanks in a missile. There's a fuel tank and the oxidization tank. And the oxidization tank in and of itself is dangerous to fuck around with. As its contents, dinitrogen tetroxide, turn to nitric acid when inhaled, causing you to drown in your own lungs if you take in too much of it.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Also, if you mix the contents of that tank with the contents of the fuel tank, it explodes. That's what it's supposed to do. It's a bomb. But you definitely don't want that to happen when you're not ready for it, since, again, it is a nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
Obviously, when fuel is leaking, you've also got the issue that any form of spark is going to cause an explosion. And a place full of metal and machinery has a lot of potential for sparks. Plus, another of their chief concerns was that if the fuel tank lost too much pressure, it would collapse in on itself, which causes a delightful combination of sparks and also inevitable mixing with the oxidization tank, which was situated on top of it. So it would collapse too if the fuel tank collapsed. So whole bunch of things.
Lots of potential here for fucking mayhem.
Yes. A million ways to die inside of this missile silo. And as I've discussed, thus destroy Arkansas and contaminate the eastern seaboard with all of the fallout of that.
Wow.
So in the control room, the first thing they heard was, uh-oh, But when they pressed Dave Powell about what uh-oh meant, he was reluctant to say exactly what had just occurred. He said he didn't want the missile commander to freak out hearing him say over the radio that there was a leak. Meanwhile, his coworker said that Dave's reaction was a little bit like when something happens and you know you're going to get in trouble with your parents and you try to like delay it. Like that was what it felt like. He was like, he knew he was going to be in trouble and he wasn't ready to grapple with it.
I'm picturing the guy as there's a stock character in The Simpsons who he maybe works at Krusty Burger. And there's
the like Zitty kid.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. Oh, I did it again. It's him. It's that guy.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an apt description of. I mean, and I have to give this guy slack because that's exactly it, right? Like you're talking about a guy who's like 21 years old, working in this, who's like, oh shit. When something goes wrong that he feels is his fault. But yeah, that's exactly kind of what we have here, sort of doofy mistake and him being like, I don't want to own up to that. And as such, it was 30 minutes before the crew convinced him to explain what happened and truly understood the scope of what they were facing. And at that point, how long?
30 minutes.
30 minutes.
30 minutes.
Situation
you won't tell anyone? Promise you won't tell anyone. Yeah, you're gonna.
He was just trying to downplay it, you know, like you know, it's no big deal. It's a little bit of a, you know, accident in here, but no problem. Everything's fine. Until face to face, he was like, okay. So I dropped this thing, and there's a hole, and there's fuel coming out of it. So by the time they knew about this, situation is like out of control, and they're like, "Fuck, what are we supposed to do?"
How was he going to cover this up? Well.
Again, this is juvenile thinking, right? Where you're just kind of like, I'm sure it'll be fine. I'll figure it out. I'm gonna fix this somehow, you know. And they figured like, okay, there's like a rooftop thing over the missile that you would open for it to launch, right? They were like, okay, we could potentially open that to vent the fuel cloud that's filling the silo.
Let some air in,
right. But this is risky because if something happened and it did detonate the bomb, they'd just be launching a giant uncontrolled nuke off into the abyss with absolutely no idea where it would land. They'd have no control over it. That's also a problem. The control room was evacuated to prevent loss of life, and even that was chaotic. And some of the guys really didn't want to leave. They were like, "This, we should probably stay here." But as they opened the door for their normal route out of the building, they found it was filled with fuel cloud. So they couldn't go that way. And they had to use an emergency escape hatch that had never actually been opened all the way before. So it was just a big metal tube with a ladder in it that climbed 50 stories to the top. And there was supposed to be at the top of this 50 stories. Yeah. Just climbing a big narrow tube on a little metal ladder, 50 stories. And it was supposed to have a light at the top that would shine down and illuminate the escape hatch. Didn't turn on.
No.
So they did that entire climb in total darkness. Evacuating the command center also meant that they were essentially relinquishing control over what the bomb was doing on a technological level. Any attempts now to stop the calamity would have to be purely manual, just the PTS team trying to figure out and fix it by hand. So that's what they attempted to do. PTS team chief Jeff Kennedy and Dave Powell, the guy who dropped the thing initially, started to descend the... What's that?
Hapless Dave.
Good old hapless Dave. Started to descend the escape hatch so that they could check the readings on the missile and gauge what needed to be done. And as they did, Kennedy told Powell to stay behind, which was a violation of a rule that stated that they always needed to do these kinds of things in pairs. But he figured it'd be much safer and quicker if he did it on his own. We're talking about that tube here. That's what they're using to move through. Navigating two guys down this to go just seemed like it would be a waste of time and potentially dangerous.
Sorry, when are we talking here? When
1980.
Okay.
Yeah. Which means that also in the documentary that I watched about this, like all these guys, so it was 2016. So they're in their like 50s and early 60s. They still are so young compared to the story they're telling. Like these should be old men, but they're all still young here.
Well, yeah, they're younger than me, younger than I am. Oh no, they wouldn't have been. Sorry, I miscalculated.
No,
Maybe cut that out.
no, this happened in 1980, but that means they were born in like 1960, like maybe late 1950s, so younger than my parents. And so he took the readings once he got down there and determined that they could fix the problem, but to do it, they would need to move fast. So he and another guy named David Livingston went down once more. But the vapor in the silo had become so thick that they could barely see in there. And they realized that they were going to have to get this vapor out before they could even begin to approach the problem.
And I'm imagining there's like alarms going off.
Oh, yeah. They're like, in fact, there's one guy who was talking about it and he was like, I was eating my lunch. I was just having a sandwich and the klaxon went off. But they're like, there's people working down there. That happens. And then it went off again and just kept going off. It's like, oh, there's a problem here. So yeah, probably very chaotic vibe. You can't see a thing through the vapor. There's these sirens going, like just
imagine Dave is crying a lot. Dave's
there's a lot of these guys talked about crying while this was happening. So it seems like a pretty overwhelming experience.
Yeah, classic Dave.
Classic tape. So the two guys, they can't see, they have to evacuate. And then Livingston went back into the silo to turn on an exhaust fan by himself. And likely due to arcing in the exhaust fan, the hypergolic fuel exploded, blasting away the 740-ton silo door and ejecting the warhead. Crew members described being thrown, quote, ass over tea kettle, or turning around to realize they were on fire. Those who hadn't suffered injuries like broken legs took off as fast as they could. Sure, they were trying to outrun a nuclear bomb. They described the explosion as looking like the sun blowing up. So they were sure the nuclear bomb had detonated and were just trying to get away. And people who were like nearby reported the same thing. Like they were like, that's it. That's the bomb going off. This is how we die. So in all, 21 men were injured, and David Livingston, the one who had turned on the exhaust fan, he died at the hospital.
Oh, I feel bad now for mocking him, poor Dave.
This is a different Dave. This isn't hapless Dave.
Oh, fine. Fuck that guy.
Yeah. But predictably, the American government was shit about the whole entire thing. No one was allowed to say that there had been a nuclear warhead there, and the public was told by figures like Bill Clinton that they'd never been in any danger of a nuclear explosion. It was fine. In return for his heroics, Jeff Kennedy was given a formal reprimand from the Air Force for violating the two-man protocol. And he said he wanted nothing to do with the Air Force after that, not because of that, but because in the wake of David Livingston's death, no one from the Air Force even came out to the hospital for 2 whole days. Like it wasn't even a priority to them to come and see these guys afterwards. And the Air Force wanted to rush the convalescing wounded out of the hospital and back on base as quickly as possible so that they wouldn't say anything about what had happened and make the military look bad. One PTS member who suffered horrendous and painful burns all over his body asked if he could wear a sneaker instead of his military-issue boot on one foot that had been mangled in the explosion and made his boots excruciatingly painful. The response he received was, quote, Devlin, I wouldn't do a fucking thing for you. Yeah. Another team member, clearly struggling with PTSD, walked into a gathering on base where there were bottles of beers on tables, and in a rage, he started picking the bottles up and throwing them. He was discharged from the military.
Oh, no.
Yep.
Just started chucking bottles about the place. Yep. Fuck.
And they're like, all right. I think you're done here.
He's gone private pile. Get him. Send him home.
I cannot stress enough that these guys would have been lifers. They were all about patriotism. They loved their jobs in the military. And then the military punished them for their heroic attempt to save millions of lives at the risk of the sacrifice of their own. They left jaded and traumatized with no support. And of course, Dave Powell was scapegoated for the whole thing, as was the case for the literally hundreds of other nuclear accidents happening all over the United States. Human error is an easy way to shirk any institutional responsibility for these kinds of things, but obviously, a dude dropping a wrench shouldn't lead to the near annihilation of the entire eastern seaboard. That's not his fault. People drop shit.
Amazing. And, it's easy to kind of hear that phrase dropping a wrench could lead to the annihilation of the entire eastern seaboard, and think, come on, you're exaggerating. That's hyperbole. But no, absolutely not.
No, it's 100% what would have happened if any little thing had gone differently. Like, this is a best case scenario, and still someone died. It was very difficult to control what had happened here. Even if he had, said something earlier about what happened, it wouldn't have been an easy fix. It still might have ended up the same way or worse. It's luck that it ended the way it did. And in 1987, 7 years later, the last Titan II was deactivated and the whole facility blown up. It's now a hill on a small cow pasture. Okay. But we still have 7,000 nuclear weapons in America, and nuclear accidents continue to happen. Not as often, but that's probably because there's just not as many.
Yep.
Bob Purifoy, who was head of weapon development at Sandia Laboratory at the time of this explosion, said in the documentary, "Nuclear weapons will always have a chance of an accidental detonation. It may be tomorrow, or it may be a million years from now, but it will happen." Yeah.
I mean, that's the Joag take on this, isn't it? I mean, that was going to be my out from this story.
Right.
How frequently is stuff like that happening? How frequently is stuff like that happening? How many times has this happened that we will never, ever know about?
Exactly. That's the thing. That, like, the idea, the guy who headed up this, this Bob Purifoy guy, who was this head of weapon development, even he had no idea that these accidents were happening, because he didn't have access to that. Nobody was sharing this information. And then, of course, when you looked at this, these hundreds of cases that these had happened in.
It is that many, is it? It's in the hundreds.
Yes, it's in the hundreds. And they were all human error, human error, human error. But again, like, that many human errors means there is something distinctly wrong with how this whole system is set up. So yeah, we've probably had way more near misses than we could possibly know about.
As a population globally, does it do us good to know how many accidents there are, how many near misses there are? Or is it something that we would be better continuing in blissful ignorance?
Well, I think, Eric Schlosser, the author's point in talking about this was that we should know this, because it's easy for us to be very complacent about the fact that this stuff is going on, and to just sort of, be like, I don't know, there's some missile stuff somewhere, or to think that we don't have these kinds of things happening, or that they're completely safe. Surely, even in the situation, the guys in the control room, when this thing initially happened, they just started trying to go through their checklists. They were like, all right, let's check this, check this, check this. They're like, certainly there is some way that we can stop this. It's fine. There's a way to stop any problem. And there isn't when something like this happens. So I think, for Eric Schlosser, he's kind of like, we should know these kinds of things, and it should be something that we make sure we, as a society, push back against, and don't let this just be, we might get destroyed someday. Oh, well.
This is not the podcast if you're quite edgy and neurotic about the state of the world, is it?
No, not so much.
This ain't the fucking cast, man.
No, it's probably not doing great things for our own mental health to talk about it. But it's a thing. We might blow up, and it might just be because someone didn't want to go back to their truck for a wrench.
And welcome aboard, friends, on flight JOAG 2404. I'm your co-pilot, Mark Lewis, and alongside my co-pilot, Corrigan Edmondson, we will be taking a very relaxed flight this evening through some very picturesque scenery. I'll be the first to remind you to look out your window when we're passing despair, as we fly through that despair towards uncertainty, angst, encroaching sense of our own mortality before we touch down maybe in an hour from now, hopefully all in a better place than we were when we took off. It's great to have you on board.